And so here we are talking about the American Civil War. It was fought for a variety of reasons, but really what we're talking about is a struggle between two societies over how the future of America will develop. Will it be free? Will it be slave? Will it be industrial? Will it be agrarian? Will it be new and modern, or will it be old and traditional? That's what we're really talking about. And so this war is going to last for 4 long, painful years. And it's really the deadliest war the United States has ever fought. Matter of fact, far more far more Americans die in this war than any other single American war, and more than most of them combined. Uh, it's uh, it's called a few different things. The Civil War is probably the most common. Growing up in the South, I heard it called the War of Northern Aggression by people who believe in the lost cause myth. But this is a war between family, and literally brother versus brother in some cases, friends versus friends. There's several stories of men who knew one another capturing the other during the war, and it's just 4 years of hell for our country that almost destroyed us. Hopefully, you recall that outgoing President Buchanan basically did nothing to stop the seceding Southern states. When Lincoln comes into office, he has already publicly announced that secession is not legal, but he's hoping that he can find a political versus a violent military solution to the crisis. And that's what he's pushing for at first. But he has a major problem, and that problem is that there are still forts that belong to the United States that are full of U.S. soldiers, U.S. troops that are in Southern territory. And part of his job as president is that he is the commander in chief of our armed forces. It is his responsibility to take care of them. He can't just abandon those forts. He's got to supply these people. They'll starve to death, or they'll have to surrender the forts. So has to he has to get permission to do this, and the South won't give it to him. And it all begins at a fort called Fort Sumter. Now, Sumter is a federal fort which guards the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. And it's kind of on an island, man-made, right in the middle of Charleston Harbor. And it's got some pretty big cannons that point out towards the sea because its job is to protect the city from an attack from the sea. It doesn't have much in the way of guns pointing towards the city because it's not supposed to shoot at the city. Okay, so, but it's held by federal troops, but it's in Charleston, South Carolina. And so Lincoln is trying to send supplies to the fort, and he does everything he can to make the South happy about it. He says, I'll send it on an unarmed ship. You can stop the ship. You can search the ship. You can look and see. I'm not sending any guns. I'm not sending any ammunition. I'm not sending any more troops. I'm just going to send food and medicine and some fresh clothes and things like that. Just supplies that they need to live. No military supplies. Just let me send this ship. And they turn away the ship once, and then Lincoln tries to get it to go again. And he tells them, look, they're going to be there on April 14th. They're going to come in on April 14th, and that's when they're going to show. So the Southerners give the guy in command of the fort, a fellow by the name of Major Robert Anderson, a deadline. And they say, on April 12th, you have to surrender by April 12th. If you don't, we're going to take the fort away from you. And they're trying to capture it before Lincoln's supply ships arrive. And they really hope that the guy surrenders. But Anderson says, I can't do that. I don't have orders to surrender it. And so he refuses to surrender. Okay, and the Southerners, under the command of a general by the name of P.G.T. Beauregard, I like his name just because it's so long, Pierre something or other Trudeau Beauregard. He's from Louisiana. Surprise, surprise. With a name like that. But he hopes to capture it before Lincoln's supply ships arrive. On the morning of April 12th, 1861, he says, open fire, and the Confederate cannons start shooting at the fort. Major Anderson's troops fight as long as they've got ammunition, which isn't for very long, and they do essentially no damage to the city. The battery shooting at the fort do essentially no damage to the fort. Nobody is killed. But after 34 hours of fighting, Anderson is out of ammunition and feels like, I have done what I can do to honorably defend the fort. I have no method of continuing to defend it, so there's no point in continuing. Somebody might actually get killed if they come over, and so he surrenders the fort. Okay. It's important not because it was a major victory, not because of the massive loss of life. It's important because this attack on Fort Sumter starts the Civil War. The South has now has shot at U.S. troops. This is an open act of armed rebellion. Up until now, it could have been handled politically, but after this point, Lincoln doesn't have any choice. His oath when he became president was to defend the United States and its Constitution, and he's got to respond, and he's got to put this down with an army. And this is just a quick map showing basically where Fort Sumter is, right there in the center. They had turned back the Star of the West when it came in January trying to resupply. This was the ship that was supposed to come back again later. Fort Johnson down there on James Island to the sort of south, pretty much just straight west of Fort Sumter, is the first to fire. And so from Fort Johnson, the first shots starting the Civil War were fired. So with no other options left to him, Lincoln calls for the states to raise troops. Remember, the United States historically has not kept a large standing army. We don't have a big army. As a matter of fact, at the time, the Confederate army was just as big as, if not bigger than possibly, the Union Army. So, because they'd already been calling for volunteers. So when this happens, Lincoln calls on the states and says, I need you to raise your troops, raise militia, start equipping them and getting them ready, and send them to me to fight. And when he does this, the states of the Upper South start to secede. And 4 of the 8 remaining slave states will choose to secede: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Interestingly, 41 counties of northwestern Virginia decide they're not going to secede with the rest of Virginia. They are quite a bit different from the plantation wealth of the south and east parts of Virginia. These are mountaineers. They live. They're basically. I mean, they're hillbillies. It's where the term comes from, is from these peoples, and they live in Appalachia, and their culture and life is so remotely different, is so different from how the Virginians down along the coast and everything live, that they don't have anything in common with them anyway. And so they say, you know what, y'all go ahead, we're not. And they vote to secede from Virginia, and will, in the course of the war, create a new state of West Virginia in 1863. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, there were several slave states that did not secede. 4 full states, and then that part of Virginia that seceded from Virginia. They still had slavery. The slavery was still legal there. Just nobody there had any money, so very few of them had any slaves. So 4 slave states don't secede. That's Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And if you look on the map over here to the right, they're the ones in the yellow, and then West Virginia right there, smack in the middle of that line. So they form a line between the free Union states and the Southern Confederate states. And for that reason, they get known as the border states. Okay, and so whenever you hear the border states, it's talking about Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, and you might throw West Virginia in there as well. So, um, and of course, the Union doesn't want any of them to secede because they don't want anybody else going over to the other side. But it's incredibly important to them. It's vital, in fact, to the Union that Maryland not secede. And I want you to ask yourself, why is that? Think about geography. That's your clue. Think about geography. So figure out, why was it so important that Maryland not secede? It was so important that Lincoln broke all kinds of laws. He did several illegal acts. He suspended habeas corpus. He threw people in jail without a reason to. He violated freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and he used troops to enforce it. And he excused it because he said, well, it's a war, it's a war, it's a war. Well, that doesn't take away people's civil rights. And Lincoln did. He basically did that in order to make sure that the state remained loyal. He threw elected officials into jail so that they could not meet and vote on whether they wanted to secede or not, among other things. All right, so let's talk for a few minutes about the strategies that both sides had, the advantages that both sides had, and then we'll get into some of the new military technology that's going to be used during this war, which is pretty interesting stuff. All right, so both sides start off the war with a strategy. This is your overall plan to win. And the Union's is developed by the chief of staff, a fellow by the name of Winfield Scott. He'd been a soldier since the War of 1812. So 49 years he's been a soldier, actually a little longer than that. And he's an old man at this point, but his plan it gets nicknamed, and it's not a nice nickname. They're actually trying to be insulting when the newspapermen call it this. It's called the Anaconda Plan. And it's two parts. And the first is to use the Navy to blockade the South. That means that the South won't be able to export cotton and make money and import guns and equipment that they can't build for themselves because they don't have a lot of industry. The second part is to take control of the Mississippi River, which will cut the South into two parts, which means by cutting it in half like that, it means that they won't be able to sneak stuff into like Mexico and bring it up and across through the Confederacy. They can't interfere with stuff going into Mexico. That would cause a war with Mexico. And so the idea is to squeeze the South into submission by denying them the things that they have to do. So it's sort of an economic plan. The problem is it's not a fast plan. And everybody's like, well, this is going to be a quick war. They're just this unorganized bunch of Southern rebels, yada, yada, yada. And we should just attack right now and take them by surprise. And that's not the plan. The Confederacy's plan is to sit on defense. They've got to just avoid losing. It's kind of like their position is kind of like if you were to start a football game with 21 points on the board for your team and nothing on the other teams, all you got to do is keep them from scoring 22. You don't have to do anything on offense. You just got to keep your defense strong, right? Just don't lose. And the idea is they're going to hold on so long that the North will get tired of the war, that will kill so many of them, and they'll spend so much money that the attrition is what this is called. It's called a war of attrition, that the losses that the North will have will cause the North to stop wanting to fight. Okay, remember there's two ways to win a war. You have to destroy your enemy's ability to make war, or you have to destroy your enemy's will to make war. And if you can do one or the other, you'll win the war. In this case, what the Confederacy wants to do is destroy the North's will to keep fighting. The Confederacy also plans on the importance of cotton. They think that they'll get help from the British in exchange for their cotton. And they really are kind of hoping that that happens early. If they can get official recognition and support from Britain, that's going to go a long way towards them winning the war. Now, midway through the war, they're going to change strategies because this strategy isn't working. It's taking too long. Even though the South is causing the North to lose far more men than the South is losing, the North has so many more they can afford to replace those losses, and the South simply can't. So they decide they're going to have to go on the offense and try to just crush the North, and that doesn't work out so well for them. And if you want to see the reason why the South lost the war, right up front, right here. This is it. The North has so much more of some very important things that there's just no way the South can keep up with it. Okay, the North has way more railroads, way more factories. They've got more money, they've got more people. They've already got an existing Army and Navy. It's all organized, it's all planned out, it's all set up, and they don't have to replace all of that. They don't have to set it up, and because that takes a lot of time and effort to get that done. And until you have all of that done, they're not as good a fighting force as they could be otherwise. And so that's a disadvantage for the South. Basically, everything that's an advantage for one side is a disadvantage for the other. The North also already has a functional government, and all of that goes with it. They've already got a tax collecting system. They've already got, all of those people are already hired. They've already got a post office system. They already have all of that figured out, organized, and running. Now in the South, most of it stays in the hands of the exact same people. Okay, the guy that was delivering your mail in Houston in 1860 is the same guy in 1861. He just changed his uniform maybe to a Confederate one instead of a U.S. one. So a lot of that's not a big change, but it is still an effort. And part of the advantages that the North has is that their government, their whole point is that the federal government is the one that's actually in charge. And so they can make the states do what they want. And the South can't do that because the South's whole argument really is that the states are the ones with all of the real authority and the real power, and they can tell the national government to go stuff it if they don't like what the national government is telling them to do. That's the whole point of this war, of seceding, okay? And so they build that into their constitution, and it makes it very difficult for them to function and to work together and to plan. All right, so the South's advantages. The South has more military schools. The South had a long tradition of military service being a very honorable profession, especially for the sons of the wealthy families. And because they've got more military schools, they tend to have better officers. They have more of them, and they tended to be better. So that was a big advantage for the South. One of the huge problems the North has is finding a really good general to lead their main army, which is called the Army of the Potomac. You need to know that. The Army of the Potomac is the main Union Army over on the eastern side, which is where most of the fighting is going to take place. The Southern Main Army over there is called the Army of Northern Virginia. Okay, so those two armies are the two biggest that they have, and they're the ones that do the majority of the fighting, especially in the east. Okay, so remember those: the Army of the Potomac for the North and the Army of Northern Virginia for the South. All right. The South's people were more outdoorsy, more athletic. They tended to be more enjoyed things like camping and hunting and things like that. So they just tended to be a little bit more outdoorsy and athletic, and as opposed to the factory workers who were often underfed and didn't get much exercise and things like that. The South has a very simple strategy. Okay, just don't lose. All we got to do is just hold out long enough. And being on the defense makes that easier. Okay, and lastly, the South is actually fighting to defend their homes. Okay, it's for the most part of the war, it's the North invading the South, and not the other way around. And so those men are going to fight that much harder when they see enemy soldiers coming towards their homes and loved ones. And so they're fighting to preserve their homes and what they call their way of life. A lot of these guys, most of the people that fought this war from the South never owned a slave. Okay, they're not fighting necessarily to preserve slavery. They're fighting for living their lives the way they think they ought to. Now, the fact that includes slavery makes it kind of a not so great way of life, but people will fight hard to do that. Imagine if somebody tried to come in and take over the U.S. and say, okay, everybody has to be one religion, and everybody has to go to this one religion, and you can't do anything else. And we're going to have one political party, and that's all there's going to be. And we're going to take everybody's personal property away, and we're just going to, I mean, people would fight against that, right? And so that's kind of how these guys felt. And this is just a nice little chart from Historical Statistics of the United States, so it's very reliable. And it shows the resources of the Union, the North, and the Confederacy, the South. Okay, look at the population differences. Look at the manufactured goods differences. That's how much industry they've got. The value of exports is pretty close because the Confederacy is exporting so much cotton. It was worth so much money. Okay, but they don't have any ships to carry it. Look at the next one. Okay, most of the cotton was being carried in northern ships. Guess what? It's not doing that anymore. Look at how much railroad the North has compared to the South. How much food production, grain production, they're talking about food. The number of farms, way more farms, twice as many farms in the North as in the South. Now, they weren't as big, but they were food producing. Iron production, huge difference. Banking capital, that means money, how much money they've got. Look at those differences. It's not hard to see why the North has so many resource-based advantages. Wars are very frequently a reason why technology gets advanced. People want to improve on existing technologies or create entirely new ones to give them an advantage to help win the war. Some sort of secret weapon. And it doesn't actually have to be like a weapon that kills people, but some sort of secret idea, plan, concept. Could be a weapon, could be a tool, but whatever it is that is going to give them an advantage to your side to help you win the war. So like a great example is the development of computers and radar in World War II. Gave the Allies a huge advantage over the bad guys because, for example, we could break their codes using computers and we knew what they were saying faster than they could decode them. I mean, our decoders worked faster than theirs did in some cases. So we got their messages faster than they did. And we could use radar, for example, to intercept attacks. And the bad guys, the Germans and so on, thought that we were just getting lucky. It had nothing to do with luck, it had to do with technology. All right. Well, the Civil War is sometimes called the first mechanical war or the first modern war because during this war, for the first time, you're going to see several machines and technological devices and ideas used effectively for the first time. Some of the things had been used before, but never in this sort of numbers or to this to the point where it was actually of real genuine benefit. And so that's why it's often called the first modern war. So these are the 7 different things that we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail. The 7 technologies that are probably the most impactful either on this war and its results or for the future of warfare. And these are the mini ball, a new bullet, which makes rifles better. Ironclads, these are ships covered with metal armor. The Gatling gun, which is essentially a hand-cranked machine gun and the first of its kind. Submarines, the first successful submarine attack. The use of aerial observation in an organized and widespread fashion for the first time. The first effective use of railroads for military purposes. And the improvements in medicine that would be coming out during this war and used for the first time and really changing how things look. And we'll start off with the mini ball. And if you look down to the right hand, that is an actual Civil War era mini ball. And it's called the Minié ball. It was designed by a French officer named Minié. So it's properly called the Minié ball, but nobody calls it that. They just say the mini ball. And it's a new kind of bullet. And you can see how it's shaped there. That's an actual one. It's the white on it is just from being in the ground and just being old. It's just oxidation on the lead metal. They were made of lead. And they solved a problem. The problem is that the old style smooth-barreled, muzzle-loaded muskets that we've talked about, that they had fought the American Revolution with, that they had fought the French and Indian War with, even that they had fought the Mexican War with, they lack power and accuracy compared to a gun with grooves in it. A rifled gun is what that's called. But rifles take a very long time to load. And that makes it where the advantage in being able to shoot many more times outstrips the improvements of range and power that you get with a rifle. So this Frenchman comes up with a solution, and this is a cone-shaped bullet. It's conical, and it's small enough to slide down the barrel like the round balls that you put into a smoothbore. But when the bullet is fired, the base expands to fit tightly, and that makes it spin. That helps it to spin. And how hard do they hit? Well, there's a picture of a human femur, the end of it, that has been hit by a mini ball. This was actually removed from a soldier back during the Civil War. And you can see the kind of damage it does when it hits a bone. That middle part, there's a reason it's not there. The bullet smashed it into so many little tiny pieces that all of that part was lost. So when they put this back together to show, it's got this great big gap. These bullets hit hard. Imagine if you were to take your arm and put it on a railroad track or something like that, or a heavy-duty table, and someone was to come along with a sledgehammer and hit your arm. That's what it was like. It didn't just hurt you, it smashed bones. Very, very lethal. Okay, so what makes a rifled musket better than a smoothbore is that the rifles have grooves inside the barrel which put an axial spin on the bullet. And it spins kind of like when you throw a football properly, and it spins on its axis like that. You know that throwing a football, it goes farther and straighter if you put a spin on it than if you were to, say, take a volleyball in your palm and just kind of chuck it. And the physics of it is the same. I can't explain it to you exactly. I just know that it does work. Tightly fitting bullets are also going to get more of the gunpowder's power behind them. The loose-fitting bullets, a lot of the gas when you fired the gunpowder would escape past the bullet and go out and not be pushing the bullet, so it doesn't come out as fast. This tight-fitting bullet captures all of that, and so it gets a lot more power behind the ball. So it's going to come out faster. It makes them more accurate and harder hitting. So this big, heavy, and they're about .58 caliber, which means 0.58 inches across. So a little bit more than a half inch across. Most military rifles these days are about .223 caliber, so just shy of a quarter inch across. This is more than twice the size of a modern M16's bullet. Anyway, so what this does is it's now a harder hitting, much more accurate weapon. And so these rifled muskets had a much greater effective range than the old style smoothbores, which were good out to maybe 100 yards, maybe, much better at 50 to 60 yards. This means that out to about 300 yards, you were really effective with this, and it had the power to kill at about 1,000 yards. It was hard to hit somebody at that range, but if you could, the bullet still had enough power behind it to do some serious damage. Here's the problem. All of the people who train the soldiers in this war, all of the officers and generals, the older men who had fought in any previous war, everybody that had any experience from the last war, which was the Mexican War, learned with smoothbore guns. And they learned how to fight that way. And what happens is that's how they try to fight this war. So they try to get within 100 yards, and just like they used to have to in order to be effective. And what happens is, instead of half the bullets hitting at 100 yards, like 2/3 or 3/4 or 90% of the bullets are hitting at 100 yards. And so you see much, much higher casualty numbers. A lot of people were killed, and this is true in later wars too, where people try to fight using the tactics, the way of fighting from a previous war without making adjustments for the new equipment, the new technology. And so this new technology makes these rifles much more dangerous. The average infantry weapon, much, much more dangerous. And so you see huge casualty lists. The simple change in weapons probably doubled the number of people that died in this war. All right, moving on. We're going to talk a little bit about ironclads. We'll talk some more about a specific pair of ironclads in the next lecture, where we talk about some of the specific battles of the war. But the technology is the solution to a problem, right? That's why we come up with new technologies, is to solve some issue we have, to meet some need that we've got. And the problem is wooden ships are vulnerable to cannonballs, and they're especially vulnerable to a brand new kind of cannonball that has just been invented recently called a shell. And instead of being just a big solid hunk of metal like an old traditional cannonball, shells actually have a powder charge inside them. And when they burst through the side of a wooden boat, then they explode inside the wooden boat. Explosions inside wooden boats cause fires. Fires destroy boats. So they've got to keep these shells from penetrating into the ships. Okay, wooden ships have become incredibly vulnerable because of this other new technology that predates the Civil War by a bit. So the solution that they come up with is to look back and say, well, how did we used to protect things from getting holes punched in it? They said, well, we put metal armor on it. Okay, let's do that. And so they cover the outside of boats with metal armor. And because it's usually made of iron, they get known as ironclad. So it's a wooden ship, but it's got metal armor on the outside. Both sides of the Civil War will build ironclads. The very first battle between armored ships is going to take place during the war, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. All right, so even with the use of mini balls, a muzzle-loaded gun takes a good while to load. Still takes anywhere from 10 to 15 seconds per shot. And so that really limits how many bullets you can shoot at the enemy and how many enemy you can harm. So a man named John Gatling will design a new kind of gun. And it has multiple barrels. And as they rotate through a sequence, and as they rotate, they each do a different step in the loading, firing sequence. Okay, so while one barrel was firing, another barrel was loading, and the others were either ejecting the casing or whatever. Okay, and so this hand-cranked machine gun will be the very first practical machine gun ever used in a war. Although they didn't use very many of them in this war, it just first appears here. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Army, because they don't really have a doctrine, an idea of how to use such a weapon in combat, they pass on it during the war. The only person that is interested is one particular general actually buys 4 of them from Gatling out of his own pocket and takes them and uses them in a siege to help keep Confederate heads down. It was a Union weapon. A big surprise. The Union had more money to do things like this, but it was a huge improvement. It could fire up to 600 rounds per minute. That's 10 per second. So that's about 100 times faster than the best rifleman could do. About 100 times faster than that. So you could take that, and 4 of these would shoot just about as fast as an entire regiment of infantry. And so you could just put out just walls of bullets. shocking as it is, it's true that the actual first successful submarine attack against a surface ship was made in 1864, way before submarines were anything like the modern devices that they are. It was not the first attempt to ever attack someone with a vessel that went underwater. That was actually during the American Revolution, a vessel called the Turtle, and it was just a disaster. And anyway, it didn't work, didn't do anything. It wandered around and got lost. Anyway, but the Hunley is a hand-cranked vessel, for lack of a better word, that went just under the surface of the water. It didn't dive terribly deep. It was kept in a harbor. It had no seagoing capability, really, and it was started off life as a steam boiler, actually. And basically all they did was seal it up, put a hatch on the top and a propeller out the back that they cranked by hand. And I'll show you here in a minute what it looks like. It was tiny, it had 8 people in it, and it used a weapon called a spar torpedo, which is basically, a spar is a long stick, and the torpedo part was a bomb on the end of it. So basically this is a bomb on a stick, and the idea is that you would ram it into the ship that you were attacking underwater, and then when you backed up, it would pull the fuse. It was attached by a rope, by a line to the ship, to your ship. When you backed up, it would set off a big explosion underwater right up against the side of the enemy ship, blowing a great big hole in it and letting all the water in and sinking the ship. And it worked as far as that's concerned. They actually sank a vessel called the USS Housatonic in the harbor of Charleston with their spar torpedo. But it never came back. The Hunley never made it back, and they're still not entirely sure what happened. It sank again. It had sunk before in a couple of trials while it was out trying to see how it all worked, including one time where it took its designer, the eponymous Hunley, down with him, and he died at that time. All 8 of the crew perished when this happened. And the ship itself was located in the harbor in 1995. 5 years later, they managed to bring it up. They reinterred the bodies in, or the remains, there wasn't a lot left, in cemeteries. And that's the story of the Hunley. The rest of the ship, or parts of it, are on display in a museum. And this is what the CSS Hunley looks like. You can see at the bottom there how it was set up for them to crank. They all sat on one side and worked the crank from that one seated position on the side. And in the top image, you can see basically it's just a long sort of cylinder looking thing. It's got a rudder at the back to help steer it from the propeller pushing the water, and a couple of hatches that you climbed in and out through the top. And then you can see that long stick there at the front with the big blob of bomb on the end of it. And that's the spar torpedo. Now, aerial observation had been used by other armies before this, but not in any large-scale conflict, and never with both sides having it. And the hot air balloon had been developed in the 1700s. The balloons that these guys use, and that's all we're talking about. We're not talking about airplanes yet. We're not talking about anything like that. We're talking about a hydrogen-filled balloon, and they were manned, and they would fill the balloons with hydrogen. It was generated by mixing hydrochloric acid with zinc shavings, and you get zinc chloride and hydrogen gas as a result of that, which you can see in this photo. They're actually doing that. The wagons to the left are where they're generating the hydrogen, and it's going through those pipes, those hoses, to fill the balloon. And then a person would get into a basket underneath it, and it would raise them up several hundred feet. And from 800, 900, 1,000 feet up, they would be on a big thick rope that kept them tied down, so they would be anchored. They didn't just free float. They would get up there with a set of binoculars and look around, and they could see for miles and miles and miles. Now, this is the best form of reconnaissance that they had available. Other than sending some guys on horses over to look what's on the other side of that hill, this is all they've got. They don't have satellites, they don't have airplanes, they don't have any of that. So they don't have radar. This is what they've got. And so what they would do is they go way up high. And the Union, of course, had more of them than the South. It was a big surprise. And both sides had them, though. And they would go way up there, and messages would be sent down to officers below who would wait down below. And so the guy would write a little note on a piece of paper, tie it to a rock or something, and just drop it over the side. Eventually, they figured out that dropping rocks from several hundred feet up was dangerous for the people below. And they did one of two things. They either used a telegraph wire, which they attached to the rope, and it just went up with them, and they could telegraph down a message. Or, and this was actually really ingenious, they would put metal rings around the rope and tie the note to that, and then just let go of the ring, and it would slide down the rope and hit a bell at the bottom, and just bing, and everybody knew, hey, there's a message from the guy up there. I'm going to open it up and read it. Anyway. So they would send the message down to the officers below and say, hey, there's, a big bunch of bad guys about 6 miles away on the other side of those hills. And they could tell the general, okay, that's what's going on. And the general could then use that to help move his soldiers around where they needed to be, or decide, hey, we need to get out of here, or whatever. It was a dangerous job. The balloons themselves weren't terribly safe. And even though they did their best to paint them in colors that would sort of blend in with the sky and everything, you could see them from a long way off. And if you knew somebody was way up there spying on you, you did your best to go and make sure they couldn't do that anymore. And sometimes they would chase them down and either cut them loose and they'd float away, or try to burn them or something. Anyway. So it was a pretty dangerous sort of pastime. I'm guessing that that whole area where that photo was taken was something of a no smoking area. The railroad. The railroad had been around for a while, but this is the first big war that's going to be fought since the development of railroads in the industrialized nations, where both sides will have access to them. And so we see just how important it is. Historically, the biggest limitation on the practical size of an army, of any army, was your ability to keep it supplied, to keep food coming to it, to keep boots on their guys' feet, to keep ammunition for their guns, whatever supplies it was that you needed. The bigger the army, of course, the more of it you needed, and the harder it was to get those things to them before they went bad, before your transportation, if you were using animal-drawn transportation, it just took a long time. They might eat up more food than you could get to them, whatever. Anyway, so that's why most armies before this time period were, relatively speaking, pretty small. When Napoleon invaded Russia with over 100,000 men, that was an insanely big army. It had been a long time since anybody had seen an army anything like that big. So what the railroad means is that you can move supplies from farms that are hundreds of miles away in a matter of a couple of days. And so you can grow your stuff and make your stuff miles and miles and miles and miles away from where all the fighting is going on, where it can't be damaged, where the factories and the farms aren't going to be harmed, and then still get the stuff you need to the men. And so you could have a bigger army. Another thing you could do is you could move soldiers on it. And so you could take soldiers who were, 20, 30 miles away, in a matter of an hour or two, once you got them all on the train, you could get them from wherever they were 30, 40 miles away to near where they're going to fight. And so you could concentrate your army and get more troops. You could stay spread out to keep an eye on things. And then when the fighting was about to happen, the day before, you could move everybody in close to fight. So that was a huge advantage. Normally that would have taken a couple of days of walking, and you'd have been tired when you got there. Now they show up the same day, and they're ready to fight. Okay. not all tired out. And so railroads become really important, and the generals really figure this out really quick. And so they start, especially the Southerners, they start targeting railroads for raids. And so they'll put a few hundred guys on horseback and send them way up into the north or way down into the south. And they say, okay, sneak way back there. And then when you start finding railroads, start burning the bridges, start tearing up the rails, start doing all this to damage them so that they can't do this, and we can slow down their ability to fight and attack us. And one of the things they would do is here in this picture here, I want to say this was in Atlanta that I saw that. I want to say that one was in Atlanta. Anyway, its nickname is the Sherman bow tie. And basically what you do is when you tear the metal rails, the track, the rails of the track itself off of the wooden ties that go across. If you've ever seen a railroad, you know what I'm talking about. They've got the cross pieces that are made of wood, which are called ties, and then you got the long, skinny rails, the rails. And they would make a fire out of the ties. They would light those on fire and then throw these tracks on top of those so that they would get hot and soften up. And then they would take that softened metal and using horses or oxen or even just lots of guys, they would start to bend it and wrap it around trees just like this to ruin it. That track is not going to be reusable. You could theoretically take it, send it all the way back to a factory, melt it all the way back down, and make a new rail out of it. But that's a lot of effort. This is way better than simply tearing the rails off and throwing them away, because then all they got to do is come back, nail them back in place, and the railroad can keep going. Okay? So this was one of the ways that they would wreck and disable the railroads. During the Civil War, and really every war that has ever been fought until World War II, the big killer of soldiers was not being hurt by an enemy. It was disease. Diseases killed more soldiers than anything else for every war mankind has ever fought until about the 1930s, and that's basically World War II. And that's because they didn't have anything to treat it with. By World War II, just at the end of World War I, they start developing true antibiotics, and that's going to make a huge difference in the number of people that survive injuries and illnesses and things like that they're exposed to because they're out fighting and doing all these things that are going to cause infections and all like that. Anyway, drinking unclean water and those sorts of things. So the germ theory had only very recently been advanced. It was not widely accepted yet. Doctors did not worry about things like really sterilizing instruments. They might wash them off, but they'd wash them off in a bowl of water and then use them on the next patient and then wash them off again in the same bowl of water and use it on the next patient, and so on and so on and so on. But there were some advancements during the war. One of the big ones is that they started to use anesthetic during surgery for the first time widespread in the Civil War. In a lot of movies you see where they don't have any and they make it. That's not true. There were shortages sometimes, obviously. I mean, that happens. That's a realistic thing. But particularly in the North, most of them had access to either ether or chloroform, which would knock you out. And that's important because it cuts down on the number of patients who die during the surgery because of shock, because of the pain and damage being done during the surgery. Both sides also start to create battlefield hospitals that were as close to the fighting as they could be and not be in danger. Sometimes just only a few hundred yards behind the soldiers. And that was because they had discovered that the faster you treated somebody, the more likely it was that they would survive. And they even start to implement a triage system where basically if you had a head injury or an injury to your torso, your abdomen, your chest, then they've kind of put you over to the side to get to if you lived long enough. And then they started treating people who were injured in their extremities, in their hands, their feet, their arms, their legs, because those people were more likely to survive anyway. So basically, what they're doing is choosing to work on the people who are more likely to survive rather than the ones with the worst injuries necessarily. After surgery, the use of opiate painkillers has come into fairly widespread use. They have morphine that they can inject. They've got laudanum, which is opium dissolved into alcohol, so you can just drink it like a medicine. And they use that for dealing with pain after surgery. But there is no regulation of any of that. You don't need a prescription for it or anything. You can literally go to the drugstore and just buy as much of it as you want. And what happens is that both of those substances are addictive, and addiction to opiates becomes known as the soldier's disease. It is so common because they use too much of it and they got addicted. Now, this is the sort of kit that a Civil War era surgeon would own. Note that it is velvet lined, and they would store their items in there, take them out, and start using them. Not exactly the cleanest thing in the world. We start off, the big thing that's most obvious right there, smack dab in the center of the top, is the bone saw. That's what they use to cut through bones. It's basically a fine-tooth hacksaw. There's also a hammer up above it on the left, used for breaking bones. There's a drill used for trephination. That's the drilling of a small hole in the skull to relieve pressure from head injuries. It sounds bad, and it is, but the other option was certain death. So sometimes they could relieve the pressure from a brain injury by drilling a small hole there. They had knives and scalpels. That's all in the bottom there, all those things. The long kind of skinny looking thing, that's a tourniquet that was used to cut off the flow of blood to a limb. And you can also see a couple of things. There's a big long curved one and then a long straight one. Those are forceps. Those were for withdrawing things, pulling things like bullets out of a body. Now, the next slide, if things bother you, if seeing human remains bothers you, you may want to skip through it. I'm going to pause for just a second so that you can kind of just fast forward a little bit because there's a picture in it that might be a little disturbing to folks, but I think it puts forth a lot of the impact of what this was like, and that's why I've included it, not because I'm big on showing things for shock value and such. Okay, so I'm going to pause for just a few seconds so that before this slide advances, you have a chance to sort of skip along to the end. And really, this would be the last slide for this lecture, if that's the case. I warned you. Approximately 70% of the battle injuries received during the Civil War were to the limbs, the extremities, arms and legs and hands and such. And the most common treatment for a serious injury to those was amputation. And that was to prevent the wound from getting what they called surgical fevers back in those days. But nowadays we would call septic, turning septic and getting gangrenous, getting gas gangrene and such. A good doctor could remove a limb from a patient in about 10 minutes. If you were in the North, you were generally lucky enough to have anesthetic, regardless of what the movies say. But in the South, sometimes they ran short fairly frequently, just like everything else. This is an actual photo from a Civil War era field hospital of the amputated legs and feet of some of the soldiers who had been injured. And that's going to do it for today. The next lecture we're going to have is going to cover some of the Civil War's leaders, some of the more important battles and campaigns, not going into incredible detail on any of them. It is a topic which absolutely we could do an entire course on, similar to in 1302 when we talk about World War II. I could do absolutely an entire course on it, but we don't offer that level here at COM. Anyway, so that's what our next lecture is going to be about, is the leadership of the Civil War, some of the battles they fought, and I'm going to talk about a pet peeve I have about the Civil War there too, and you may want to pay attention to that. All right, well, we'll talk to you next time.